And welcome everyone to the Aspen Valley Wildlife Sanctuary for this year's Friends of the Muskoka Watershed AGM. I'm sorry I can't be with you there today, but if you look at the photo, you'll see that I'm in a very nice place. I'm in northern Italy, in the town of Urbania, on the shores of Lago Maggiore, and you'll see that it's a very difficult place to be from this photo. The next photograph you'll see is my actual office. If you look in that little window with the yellow arrow, you might see me waving out at you across the 150-year-old stone boathouse that has the wonderful boat in that I'm going to go out on the lake this afternoon. So rest assured I'm having a very difficult time in Lago Maggiore and not being with you there. What I'd like to talk to you about today is something that has been rolling around the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed office for about a year that came to be called Norm's Crazy Ideas. And it's my crazy notions about how to actually improve environmental protection in Muskoka. I'd really like to have these ideas broadly discussed, and it's coming at a time when Lou is also reaching out to the Muskoka Watershed Council community for new ideas as well, so maybe it's an appropriate time. What is our mission at the Muskoka Watershed Council and the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed? The Muskoka Watershed's Council mission is to champion watershed health, as you all know, and it does this in various ways by assessing environmental condition of the lands and lakes in the watershed and producing the report card of that assessment, and then communicating that report card results, educating both the public, policymakers, government, academics, local townsfolk about the condition of the watershed. The Friends of the Muskoka Watershed has a very, very similar mission indicated on the slide as the protection and wise management of the lands and lakes in Muskoka for the benefit of the citizens of Muskoka and all the creatures that we share the environment with, and where necessary to remediate problems that exist. Now, all of these steps, assessment, advocacy, outreach, communication, demonstration, management, remediation, are complicated, but they all have to fit together to help manage the watershed. How do we do all these things? I want to first tell you how complicated this is, and then show you how we can simplify it and consider all the steps that are needed and how they should all fit together. My overall purpose is to identify gaps in this process of looking after the environment. So let's start very quickly with pointing out to you how difficult this really is. We have 1,600 lakes as a minimum in Muskoka, and lots of rivers and ponds and swamps and bogs and forests, all kinds of different habitats that are full of life. Lake Muskoka probably has 5,000 living species in it at any one time, if not more. And every lake has these thousands of species, and they're connected to the shoreline and the swamps and the rivers, all with different species. So we have thousands of species and very variable habitats, all connected in diverse ways. So that's quite complicated. But it all works, and it's worked since the retreat of the glaciers 15,000 years ago. But there are pressures on those linked and complex habitats and watersheds now. The few that we're working on that you know about are climate change and development, both active projects that the Watershed Council is considering. But there are other stressors. Every year, somewhere between 30 and 60,000 new chemicals are introduced into the environment from industry, adding to the millions of chemicals that are already there. Those chemicals can be delivered to Muskoka lakes through wastewater, through the atmosphere, through waste, etc. And some of them, hopefully a very small number, can be problems. So pollution is one issue that we have to deal with. And we also have invading species. We all know about zebra mussels, which fortunately can't live in Muskoka lakes. Our waters are too soft. But we have other invaders in our lands and our lakes. For example, the spiny water flea, responsible for much of the watershed being coded as red for the indicator of invaders in our last report card. And we also harvest things, innocent things like maple syrup and fish and trees, and that's an additional stress on the watershed. So when something is this complicated, and we have so many steps involved in looking after it, from assessment to advocacy to communication to remediation, it's hard to keep track of all that. And in a situation like that, finding some simple model that could help us understand all the steps would be a useful thing to try and develop. I would like to take one step back from environmental protection, which is so complicated, thousands of species, thousands of lakes, and look at something that you may not think of as simple, but actually is much simpler, and develop a model for individual health care, and then we'll adapt that model to environmental protection. So what are the steps that we need to take to look after individual health? How do we spend the $50 or $70 billion a year on healthcare in Canada, and how can we conceptualize that in a simple way? It starts with an annual physical. You go to see your doctor, and what does he or she do? He measures 10 or 20 indicators of your health. And those 10 or 20 indicators of your health are not random. They actually come from health indicator research, where thousands of potential, for example, blood chemistry parameters, are reduced to just a few that are useful for assessing threats to your health. Your doctor then prepares a report. I've called it a medical report here. And the two key features of that medical report are a list of the values of the indicators of your health in comparison with the targets that indicate whether your health is good or not. So the facts of your individual health are assembled in those indicators and compared with targets for those indicators. Then something very important happens. The facts are compared with your expectations for those facts. Facts are passed through the filter of values to make a decision for whether your health is good or not. It's important to know that there's both a factual part, the indicator part, and a more fuzzy subjective part, which is what your expectations are for your health. If you're a marathon runner that wants to compete in the Pan Am Games, you might have one set of indicators. If you're like me, approaching 70-year-old guy who wants to sit on his lazy boy chair, but still be able to walk around the block, your expectations for your health might be a bit different. But what you hope will happen, as I add the last arrow called no to this figure, is that you will decide by a comparison and a discussion with your doctor, the professional versus the user, that your health is okay. And then you go away for a year and come back and have another medical a year or two from now. It's important to realize that this is a process that has to cycle. It's an assessment loop, if you want, because you're not stamped healthy when you're born and you never have to go to the doctor again. We all understand that health risks change as you age, that new indicators are developed, that baselines drift. There was no Lyme disease here 40 years ago, so new threats emerge, and for all those reasons, we regard annual physicals as something that is part of a cycle of health assessment. But let's say you arrive at the doctor with a broken leg and blood leaking out. You're going to quickly decide that you'll have a problem. Then we have another set of processes that kicks in. You have to quickly identify the cause of the problem, figure out how severe it is, choose a course of action to fix it, and then see if that course of action worked. That's the treatment phase, when there's clearly a medical problem. And it also ends with a report, a medical report, which is shared with you, at which the doctor will hopefully say, we fixed that problem, we'll see you again next year at your annual physical. So we initially have these two steps, assessment and treatment. There is a third very important phase or path or loop in this individual health assessment model, and that is prevention. But prevention has exactly the same steps as treatment. The only difference is you're dealing with a problem before it is severe. So your health is not poor, it's threatened. There's no actual cause of a problem, there's a threat to your health. But you still have to do exactly the same things as if you're treating a problem. I think in Canada, health protection costs, at least $50 billion a year. And these 9 simple steps, 9 boxes in this model, capture most of what we do to look after individual health. It's seen as circular. There are assessment steps, treatment steps, prevention steps. All are required. If somebody tells you we should work on treatment but not prevention, you should say that's crazy. We need all of these steps. But the critical thing is it can be envisaged as this sort of simple model. And one of the great uses of the model is it tells you where there are bottlenecks in overall treatment, where there is something that's not being done that you can fix. Okay, that's the simple thing. looking after individual human health is relatively simple. There's only one species, not the 5,000 that we find out in Lake Muskoka. There's only one individual, not the 10,000 times more living animals in Lake Muskoka than there are people on Earth. But we can use this model to help design a simple model to look after the environment. And here is that model. It differs in only a few ways from the individual health model that I've just given you. I think there's 13 boxes instead of 9, which will be important. Yeah. And that's because we're dealing not with one person, but with all of society that lives here in Muskoka. So I've added one more box in the middle to talk about society, not just an individual. Because we're dealing with thousands of lakes and thousands of species, in the assessment loop on the bottom left, I've overtly added a box to actually assess the background conditions in the lakes. And on the right-hand side, in the prevention and what I'm calling remediation instead of treatment, I've added one more box to overtly say we have to assess possible solutions to problems. Okay, so we now have a model, a very simple box and arrow diagram that can be used to look after the environment. Where does the Muskoka Watershed Council and the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed fit in? So here I've got the same model again, but I'm going to be adding the steps to show you what the Muskoka Watershed Council does, and then we'll see what it doesn't do, and that'll maybe help us identify steps we can then take to complete this whole conceptual model of protecting the environment in Muskoka. On the left-hand side, you see that the backgrounders to the Muskoka Watershed Council's report card is where we are selecting indicators, looking at targets, trying to figure out what we should actually be measuring that are going to be in those few, a dozen or so maps in the report card. We could have looked at thousands of things, but we only look at a dozen or so. The targets that we're going to use aren't developed by the Watershed Council or the Friends. They come from Environment Canada, they come from the Dorset Environmental Science Centre, that kind of thing. But they always have to be customized to some extent for Muskoka. A bunch of agencies are out there monitoring the indicators that we select with reference to the targets. The District of Muskoka's Water Quality Monitoring Program, the Dorset Environmental Science Centre's ongoing sampling efforts, the Muskoka Lakes Association's citizen-based water sampling program, and other programs are all out there assessing the condition of lakes with respect to targets. And the Muskoka Watershed Council assembles all of that information, or much of it, into the report card. The critical thing about the report card is the spatial analysis of the state of lakes and lands with reference to targets. And the Muskoka Watershed Council produces that, as you know, every few years, every 4 years, and shares it widely with the public. Okay. It's not enough just to say, here is the state of things. Problems are detected. So the Muskoka Watershed Council, if problems are detected, we move into the remediation loop. Does support some diagnostic research, for example, the Canadian Water Network's research to try and help identify problems. And it, more importantly, produces position papers on various environmental issues, which would help us assess possible solutions. That, I think, represents the main things that the Watershed Council, supported by the Friends, currently does to help deal with environmental problems in Muskoka. But if you look at the figure up on the monitor, you'll see that a bunch of boxes don't have an activity associated with them by the Watershed Council. There are some gaps, and every gap could become a bottleneck where the process of protecting the environment stops. So, I'm going to pick up 3 of those gaps and then propose solutions. Gap number 1, who actually is fixing the problems? Who's actually out there applying the solution that is preferred? The most efficacious, the most economically rational solution that will solve that problem for road salt or acid rain or mercury or DDT or that kind of thing. Who is actually doing the diagnostic research that once a problem is identified in the report card will allow us to really identify the cause? Is it too much development? Is it climate change? Is it acid rain? What is the actual cause of that problem that we're seeing? And finally, and maybe to some extent the most problematic, who is actually out there surveying the condition of the environment so that we can detect problems at an early stage when they're easy to fix and more economical to fix? Wouldn't it have been great if we had discovered acid rain when only 10 lakes in Muskoka were affected as opposed to several hundred. So, in brief, I have these three concerns for the future management of lakes in Muskoka. Who is applying the preferred solutions for environmental problems that we actually understand well enough to design a management strategy? So for development, algal blooms, road salt, calcium decline, invading species, mercury, climate change, who is actually out there fixing that problem? Now often it's bigger than us. Sometimes it has to be solved in the United States. But if there are situations where it can be solved locally, who is actually out there doing it? And can we help them? Or can we do it ourselves? Number two, who is surveying background conditions in our lakes to help us detect emerging problems at an early stage when they're most easily managed? The Dorset Environmental Science Center might be doing it in 8 lakes, but what about the other, 1,700? Finally, who is doing the fundamental diagnostic academic-style research to help us identify the cause of actual problems? The district employs consultants, but they're not really challenging them to do fundamental diagnostic research. It's more, once we understand a problem, can you help us figure out how to solve it? So those are my 3 concerns. On the next slide, I've listed a bunch of issues: development, phosphorus, mercury, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, invading species, climate change, calcium decline, road salt, and a bunch of those are actually already considered in our report card. So what solutions do the Friends and the Watershed Council currently support? The handbook that just came out is fantastic, and so it helps recommend solutions and preventative strategies to deal with development and phosphorus issues, invading species. Those are all mentioned in the handbook. But they're not actually problems being solved, but over the years, if everyone follows that advice, things will get better. And then things like road salt, climate change, pharmaceuticals, development are being considered in position papers that the Watershed Council is developing, which will hopefully lead to education and better practices, but it's not quite solving problems that we already know exist. Over the last year or two, and actually over the last 20 years that I've worked here in Muskoka, 30 years now, I've come to realize that we're not quite doing quite enough to solve the problems that we have. So here is 5 of my crazy ideas in this next slide. 3 of these are on the remediation side of that environmental protection model, that loop on the right, and 2 are more over on the assessment loop, that loop on the left. I'm going to focus for the rest of my 15 minutes or so on these ideas. Number 1, I think we should be tracking the status of key environmental issues facing Muskoka on an ongoing basis. Surely someone is already doing that, right? Surely somebody is out there looking at all the environmental issues and then tracking how we're doing on them. But the short answer is no. No one's actually doing that. Wouldn't that be a useful thing if we could do that? Secondly, if we know that we have an issue that's real, but we don't quite understand it well enough yet to know how serious it is or to know what to do, wouldn't that be useful to encourage research in that area? And I'm going to give one example for road salt where I think that's the case. We suspect we have an issue, but we don't really understand it well enough to know what to do about it. Number 3, what about if we're one step beyond that and we know we have an issue and we understand it, wouldn't it be nice if we can contribute to its solution? And I'm going to use a wood ash recycling idea as an example of that. And number 4, remember in the bottom left-hand side of that assessment loop I said we need fundamental research on what's happening in our lakes to find problems at an early stage, and we need to diagnose the actual from among the possible causes of problems that we know we have. And I think a great way to do that would be to fundraise for a Muskoka-based environmental research chair. And then finally, what's probably my truly crazy idea is to become the testbed for a large-scale, rapid environmental assessment program based on what's called next-gen or next-generation robotics and omics technologies. Genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, all words I don't quite understand, but excite me. Okay, let me give you the details. The first thing I think we should do, or we could consider doing, is to track the status and trends of actual environmental issues. We produce report cards, but we don't overtly compare them, one report card to the next. And I think this is something we could do. So on the next slide, I've listed a whole bunch of environmental issues. I've got a bunch highlighted that are not highlighted, where things are getting better. That's something we should track. Acid rain, chlorinated pesticides, ozone depletion, they're all getting better, and that's a good thing. But I've got a bunch highlighted in yellow where things might be getting worse. Climate change, calcium decline, road salt, invaders, forest pests. So I think just knowing that and communicating that to the public would be very useful. And we do that to some extent. But what about a case, and I'm going to use the case of road salt, where the problem is worsening, that local control could actually fix this problem, but we don't yet have policies in place that are sufficient for that fix, and we may not even yet be sure how serious the problem is. That's the case with road salt, and I'll just give an example. So the second thing I think we should be doing after tracking problems is to encourage targeted research if the issue is probably real but not well enough understood to propose what we should do. So here's 4 photographs related to road salt. You'll all recognize the salt dome on the landscape, the salt coming out of the back of a truck. We don't do things quite that badly anymore. Salt damage on conifers and a bunch of salt sitting on a bridge over a river, and with the next rain all that salt will wash into the river. Road salt is something that the district and we've all been a bit concerned about over time. So chloride levels are actually measured in the water quality program. The slide I'm showing here is data that's come from Rebecca, which is the chloride levels in the district's annual surveying of 60 to 90 odd lakes. And what I've done, you'll see the chloride concentration on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and something called the rank of lakes based on chloride on the x-axis. So that's just the lake number. So for example, in almost every year, at least 60 of the 90 odd lakes that are sampled have chloride levels less than 20. So that's why the line is so flat at the bottom. But you'll see that a few lakes have very high chloride levels, and there's one very high lake in every sampling year, and that high lake is Jevins Lake, which has had between 70 and 110 milligrams per liter of chloride each time it's been sampled. Now the current Canadian water quality guideline for chloride is 120, so Jevins Lake isn't there. But we should always ask, do the guidelines, are they really relevant to Muskoka? And there's a student called Aaron Brown who is a student of mine, and we've considered that question, and we think 120 is too high. It should be around 50 milligrams per liter to protect Muskoka lakes, and Jevins Lake is above that. So, do we know enough to actually suggest that we should change the way that we manage road salt in Muskoka? I would say not quite yet. We need to find out if there really is a problem in Jevins Lake and those levels are too high, or is the current Canadian water quality guideline good enough? I'm going to thank Peter Seibold for suggesting an approach to looking at work plans for particular issues. So the next slide I'm showing here, and I'd suggest we develop such an issue management matrix for every one of the issues facing Muskoka lakes. So it starts with what are the specifics of the threat. In the upper left part of the figure, chloride levels are rising near winter maintained roads. The Canadian water quality guideline for chloride may be too high. We have a lake, Jevins Lake, which appears to be a worst case. So we need to find out if the Canadian water quality guideline is good enough, and the best place to do that work is in Jevins Lake. How do we do that? I think the best way to do that is to find a university professor who's willing to come to Jevins Lake and tell us if there's already damage been happening. It might be a 2-year master's thesis program. I've talked to Dr. John Small at Queen's about finding a student to do this research. He said to me, Norman, I'll be happy to do that, but if you could give me a little money to help fund the student, that would be good. I would suggest this would be a good project for the Friends to take on once it becomes charitable or sooner, so we can have this needed work be done. If we could raise, let's say, $25,000 towards that student project, I'm pretty sure that it would be done. That would allow us to tell whether this threat is really serious in Muskoka, and if it is, we can move around the remediation model, take the next steps to actually suggest solving this problem. And the indicators of success would be updating the road salt strategy and stable, and as a result, stable or declining chloride levels in Muskoka lakes. Okay. Number 3. This is my third crazy idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually become more active in solving issues that are sufficiently well understood that we know action should be taken? In this slide, I've just pulled the figure for the threat of calcium decline from the last Muskoka Watershed Council report card. And you'll see that the Hollow River catchment, the whole Hollow River catchment was demarcated in red, indicating that it's stressed from this particular environmental problem. A large number of lakes in this watershed have calcium levels less than 2 milligrams per liter. At less than 2 milligrams per liter of calcium, you lose crayfish. At less than 1.5 milligrams per liter of calcium, you start losing lots of other species of life that require high calcium. That's why that whole watershed is indicated in red, because we're starting to lose life because of this particular water quality problem. By the way, for those of you that live on Muskoka, Russell, and Joseph, your calcium levels are well above this. You don't have this particular problem yet, and your part of the watershed you'll see is indicated as not stressed for this particular indicator. Okay. What actions could halt or reverse the calcium decline problem? Part of this must be dealt with at a larger scale than Muskoka. So further or continued reductions of sulfur dioxide emissions or nitrogen oxide emissions will reduce rainfall acidity, and that would reduce the leaching of calcium from watersheds, but that will require provincial, national, and international efforts. We've done that in the past. We should continue to do it now. The rain is 50% less acidic than it was 40 years ago, but it's still a lot more acidic than it would have been before industrial man. So that part of the problem is a bit beyond us. But there's a bunch of things we could do locally. We could work with West Wind and the forestry industry to make sure that they have a sense for what the calcium threat is to particular forests. They might want to consider the timing of logging cycles to allow the soil calcium to regenerate. Most of the calcium in trees is actually in the bark and the twigs, so another possibility is to leave the bark and the twigs behind. There's an opportunity to work with municipalities on their dust control programs for roads, because they tend to use calcium chloride, and that tends to be good for watersheds. There might be an opportunity both to reduce dust and increase calcium levels in lakes, which would be good. In places like British Columbia or Scandinavia, forests are actually limed. So we garden the forest, we don't mine the forest. Recognize that we can deplete soil nutrients, so I'd like to suggest we become gardeners of the forest. And lastly, I'd like to suggest that the possibility of developing a wood ash recycling program might help with this calcium decline problem in the Hollow River catchment, because all of the minerals that are in the trees are in the wood ash that comes after burning the wood. So I've done a back of the envelope calculation. That's on this next slide. How much wood ash would we actually need to solve the problem of calcium decline in the entire Hollow River catchment, which is over a 40,800 hectare catchment. Now wood ash is 40% calcium, and the watersheds are losing about 10 kilograms per hectare per year of calcium. Think of one 25-pound bag of fertilizer or limestone. That's how much calcium is being lost from these watersheds every year. So we need about 25 kilograms of ash per hectare per year to balance the amount of calcium that's being lost from the watershed. Well, it's a 40,000 hectare watershed, so we need 1,000 tons of wood ash. 1,000 tons. That number initially scared me, so then I did a little more calculation. So I don't know how many people we have here that use fireplaces all year, but let's say we have 80,000 people, 1 out of 20 burn wood. They burn about 5 cords a year, each weighs about 1,000 kilograms or a ton, 2% of which would be ash. So Muskoka produces about 400 tons of wood ash per year, almost half of what we would need to deal with the calcium problem from the entire Hollow River catchment. Now wood ash has a density of 500 kilograms per cubic meter, so the 400 tons occupies about 800 cubic meters, so we need a 5,000 square foot building to house the wood ash. So I think one average salt dome would be big enough that could take all the wood ash that we need to fix this problem. So I would like to suggest that we scope out not not a plan for the whole 40,000 hectares, but a plan for a pilot project initially, maybe in a 10-hectare watershed, to figure out if this will actually work. If we can get, for 10 hectares, we need not 1,000 tons of wood ash, but 250 kilograms of wood ash per year. So 10 25-pound bags, it's not, or 10 50-pound bags. So it's not nearly as daunting a task. Let's see if this would work. And that's something that the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed could fundraise to try and do. I'm actually having a conversation actually tomorrow, which for this talk would have been 2 weeks ago, with a professor who I'm hoping will work with us on this project. My last two ideas. One is a Muskoka-based University Environmental Research Chair to improve diagnosis. The model for this is Dr. David Hamilton's chair at Waikato University in Hamilton, New Zealand, the New Zealand Bay of Plenty Regional Council Chair in Lake Management and Restoration. In this chair, the regional municipality funds the university to hire a professor to do fundamental diagnostic research on the state of lakes in their municipality. It's quite remarkable. And David himself has brought in many millions of dollars to execute that task. And I think it would be fabulous if we could support such a research chair here in Muskoka. I'll leave that idea there. Now my truly crazy idea is to use Muskoka as a test bed for watershed scale assessment using environmental genomics. The idea here is to work with John Colburn, who's a North Bay boy, who now is a professor of environmental genomics at the University of Birmingham in the UK. That wonderful tower you're seeing in the picture was the inspiration for the Lord of the Rings tower series because the author, Tolkien, was a classics professor who worked there for a few years. John Colburn is currently fundraising for multi-million euro projects to develop rapid robotics assessments of the threat of thousands of pollutants. He's doing this with model species that are shown in the slide that's in front of you now. Those model species are worms and flies and fish and frogs and water fleas and some human cell lines. And the critical thing is that using the equipment that you see on the right, robotics, next-gen sequencers, they can generate tens of thousands of data points a day. And the goal is to move the assessment of the threat of chemicals to the point where it's rapid and comprehensive. And what I'm talking to Dr. Colburn about is doing the same thing on water samples. So on the left of this slide is the location of the Lake Partner Program lakes of the MOE. And John is very interested in actually analyzing raw water samples using his techniques so that we can potentially assess everything. Not just measure phosphorus, not just measure calcium, but measure the real threat that might be there on a lake-by-lake basis to particular water quality threats using his techniques. So, I'm going to start wrapping up. What could we do to improve the protection of Muskoka lakes and forests? I'm going to suggest 5 things. Develop and use an issue matrix to evaluate ongoing threats and ongoing progress. To encourage targeted research on threats that we think are serious but we don't yet understand well enough to suggest management, and I use the road salt example for that. Number 3, to promote specific action when we know we have a problem and we think we know what the causes of that problem are. And I use the wood ash recycling as an example of that. Number 4, to fundraise for a Muskoka-based environmental research chair to do fundamental diagnostic research and descriptions of the conditions of our lakes to help us find problems at an early stage. Number 5, to support robotics-based water assessment procedures using the burgeoning environmental genomics field by a collaborative project with the University of Birmingham. And then I'd like to humbly propose these 5 ideas and add them to the ones that Lou is assembling, ideas that might change or alter or complement the good work that the Watershed Council is already doing. Now, who should do all this? It could be new committees of the Watershed Council, it could be current committees, it could be new committees of the Friends, it could be and probably should be collaborations of the Watershed Council, the Friends, and other like-minded groups in Muskoka. This all needs thought and discussion. We are already all very busy, and I don't want to replace or eliminate anything that we're currently doing, because it's all part of the environmental management process. But I, for example, am willing to take a crack at fleshing out the wood ash idea, and I'm hoping others might be sufficiently caught by some of these notions that they might also get involved. I've just put up a picture of Lake Orta, which is thought of in Italy as the gem of northern Italy, a spectacularly beautiful lake, and you're looking at the monastery on the island in the middle of the lake overlooking the medieval town of Orta, which is a wonderful place. But wonderful places can hide dark secrets. This entire lake was acidified by a textile factory. And the last slide I'm showing here is the remediation of Lake Orta, which was the addition of 100 tons of limestone a day to the lake for a whole year to fix their problem. I'm not suggesting we have problems this serious in Muskoka, but we do have problems that need remediation, and I look forward to working with friends and the Watershed Council to help deal with these problems in the future. I'd like to end by, because I'm not here, by thanking Dennis for chairing the meeting, by thanking Marg and Jim for their service on the board over the last year. They were tremendously helpful to me. I learned a lot from both of them, and I look forward to working with them in the future, but not on the Friends board. I wish you a wonderful day at the Aspen Valley Wildlife Sanctuary. I wish I could be there with you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.